many of these people that are in informal sectors find the difficult choice of staying at home and not having any income, or having to venture outside to get the income, but clearly contributing to the negative evolution of the pandemic. What it has happened is that now we are in a really dramatic situation when you take all this into account, because the region has already more than 3 million cases of COVID. And when I say cases, I always refer to officially recorded cases. I think that all the estimates that we have suggest that the number of cases is much higher, because what calls the attention is that on a per capita basis, the countries that are showing the most cases are Chile, Peru, which are the countries that are testing the most. You know? So clearly, this is, if you test, you're going to find the cases. So from that, we can extrapolate what we could have, and the 3 million probably is a lower bound. The number of cases are going to be much higher, with a mortality rate of about 5%, a little less than 5%. This is consistent with what we are finding in other parts of the world. And indeed, the WHO at a certain moment was stating that Latin America was becoming a hotspot for the COVID. So this is one of the areas where we are seeing that the pandemic is a little bit more aggressive. And on the other hand, we have the economic crisis. Our estimates in the global economic prospects were released in June this year, just last month. We're estimating a contraction for Latin America of 7.2% in GDP for this year. After that, the IMF has updated their projections. They are at minus 9.4%. We're going to continue correcting. Personally, I think that we are going to end lower than minus 10, between minus 10, minus 12% at the end of the year, because of what I was saying. We are seeing that the tension between the evolution of the pandemic and the economic impact that it is hitting us. I'm pretty sure that Roberto will elaborate a little bit more on Colombia. At this stage, what we are projecting for Colombia is to close to minus 7% for this year in terms of growth, and a fiscal deficit in the 9%, 10%, 8%, depending on how many things are going on. Now, I know just 30 seconds more. One of the things that I would like to stress is that this is not only a time to take a stock of how bad things are. I think this should be a time to take a stock of how we are going to get out of this and what do we need to do. And in the what we need to do, probably I would like to emphasize that it will be important that the region start thinking what are the measures that we have to implement to get out of this crisis, not as we were before, but basically to get out of this crisis as a much more modern region, where we start having education systems that are working, where we start having a private sector that acts as an engine. The debt levels are going to be stratospheric after this crisis, so the governments are not going to be able to be the engine of the recovery. It will have to be the private sector. But if we want the private sector to be the engine, we will need to have countries that are attractive to private sector investment and so on. So there are a number of things, I think, that probably we will have time to review later that are going to be critical at this stage. And that would be my invitation to everybody. And the numbers are awful, are dramatic, are very bad, no matter. I mean, you can look at them the way you want. There is no optimistic point here. And I think that until we have the vaccine, things are going to continue in a negative trend. The question is, okay, what are we going to be doing the day after? And I think that this is where we should. Apologize if I took a little bit more than expected, but back to you, Maria Paula.
Thank you. No, that's perfect. So, Roberto, the central banks in the world are playing a key role in supporting their economies and providing liquidity and stability to the markets through conventional and unconventional policy tools. So could you please tell us, in the case of Colombia, what are the measures that Banco de la República have implemented during this period?
Thank you very much, Maria Paula. Let me start by thanking the Colombian American Association for their kind invitation. I would like to start with two disclaimers. One is that I only speak on my behalf. I do not speak on behalf of the central bank nor its board of directors. And second, I will only talk about monetary policy. We have an unwritten agreement with the government. We at the central bank don't like the government to talk about monetary policy, and the government doesn't like that the central bank talks about fiscal policy. So I'm going to only make my remarks in reference to monetary policy. As you might be aware, until February, the Colombian economy was doing quite well. Actually, it was probably the stellar performer in the region. Growth was expected to surpass 3%, probably approaching 4%, and inflation was well within target. The crisis has hit the Colombian economy particularly hard. It's not only the lockdown, like in many other countries, but also a sharp decline in oil prices. Obviously, the demand for oil went down, but there was also a huge surge in supply, so prices went down. And although not as severe as in the case of small Latin, Central American countries, Colombia depends quite significantly on remittances. So the lockdown, the decline in oil prices and remittances, they all came together at the same time. So the shock experienced by the Colombian economy has been particularly severe. On the positive side, Colombia received this confluence of shocks with a rather strong policy framework, in particular a fiscal rule guiding public finances and an inflation targeting framework with a fully floating exchange rate regime. Our first question is to be addressed is, why can we afford to have a fully floating exchange rate regime, which is not the case in many other countries? And I would say that we meet two conditions. One is there is a relatively low pass-through from the exchange rate to prices. And second, there is strong evidence that currency mismatches are not significant. They are insignificant in the financial sector on account of regulation. They are not significant in the corporate sector, and they are not a major concern for the sovereign, given that the government's debt, 70% of it is issued in local currency. So the first line of defense with regard to the recent shock has been to allow the exchange rate to move in tandem with fundamentals. So obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a very sharp depreciation of the peso. And like elsewhere, the cumulative shocks have produced a sharp rise in the preference for liquidity and a significant rise in risk aversion. So the central bank's actions, which have been supported by certain government interventions, which I will not detail, have been aimed at three things. First, to ensure the proper functioning of the payment system. Second, to stabilize key markets, including the foreign exchange market and those for private and public debt. And third, to contribute to the provision of liquidity, so to enhance credit to households and firms, in particular, setting the stage for a solid recovery once the main concerns regarding the pandemic subside. In pursuing these objectives, the main actions, and here I go to your question, Maria Paula, undertaken by the central bank have been the following. Regarding our repo operations, we have expanded amounts, tenors, and admissible counterparts and collaterals. It's interesting to note that we went from doing repos only with public debt to repos with private debt, and now we do repos with bank loan portfolios. Second, we have undertaken outright purchases of both public and private debt. We have reduced reserve requirements. We have provided non-delivery forwards and swaps to deal with foreign exchange currency risk and foreign currency liquidity needs. The central bank's interest rate, that's equivalent of our federal funds rate, has declined 175 basis points and now stands at 2.5%. And the central bank has strengthened its foreign currency liquidity position. To that effect, we have renewed the flexible credit line that we have had with the IMF for now over 10 years. We purchased $2 billion directly from the Treasury, and the central bank has gained access to the Fed's FEMA repo facility. The main results of these interventions have been mostly positive. On the bright side, key asset prices have stabilized. For example, interest rates on private and public debt are back to their pre-crisis levels. That is a major achievement. Second, portfolio inflows have increased, particularly in reference to public debt, not so much with regard to the equity market. Third, risk premiums have gone significantly down, but they are still higher in comparison to pre-crisis levels, and this is true for all of any Latin American country. But on the not so bright side, notwithstanding the abundant provision of liquidity and the granting of government guarantees, credit by the financial sector has recovered only very slowly. And this is due to two factors. Banks face two risks. On the liquidity side, even though the central bank has been very active in providing liquidity, depositors have a strong preference for short-term maturities. And that has not changed significantly in the last couple of months. And on the asset side, there is obviously significant risk in extending loans to households and small and medium-sized firms, fortunately not so much to large corporations, which have had ample access to financing. Where do the main macroeconomic indicators stand following these interventions? One is that inflation and inflation expectations are going down fast. This is, of course, the result of a huge contraction in demand and also of temporary measures, including tax holidays and the freezing of prices for many utilities. Interestingly, and notwithstanding the sharp decline in exports, particularly oil exports, the contraction in imports and the decline in profit remittances by foreign corporations have contained the current account deficit to the point that it is now expected to decline as a percentage of GDP. That is a welcome development, given that Colombia's large current account imbalance was a concern at the beginning of the pandemic. As Humberto was saying, GDP is expected to contract significantly in 2020, somewhere between 4 and 7%. Our view, and here probably I'm talking not only on my behalf, but on behalf of any policy actor in Colombia, as long as the financial sector remains strong, there is the perception that the actions I have described, together with the gradual lifting of the lockdown, are expected to deliver positive results starting in the third quarter of 2020. And key indicators, including electricity and cement deliveries and the like, have certainly recovered lately. So there is a perception that the worst quarter, the second quarter, is history and that the recovery might be starting now. But in all likelihood, as long as the financial sector remains strong, we don't expect to revisit the experience of the late 1990s. We had a severe contraction in 1999. The financial sector was in a mess, so the recovery took a very long time. This is not the case this time around, and we are in the understanding that the sharp contraction in 2020 will be followed by some strong recovery in 2021, and the estimates by the staff of the central bank is that by early 2022, GDP should once again have reached pre-crisis levels. So that is where we stand right now, and I stand open to your questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Very insightful. Maria-Leticia, turning to you, Humberto mentioned the strategic role of the private sector and how it will play during the recovery. Also, in light what we all know, and also Roberto was alluding on, the restrictions of sources from the public sector. So from your position and your clients, what you have perceived on the challenges, but also opportunities on Colombia, the investment, the attraction of capital inflows in the post-pandemic area, in light also of Colombia becoming a member of the OECD?
Thank you, Maria Paula, and thank you to the Colombian American Association. It's really a pleasure for me and for Willkie to be part of this panel and with such a stellar speakers. So, few things that have been already mentioned by Roberto and Humberto. So, well, Colombia was doing quite well right before the pandemic, and what we heard from a lot of our clients is that, well, they were really putting their eyes on Colombia, and compared to the rest of the Latin American countries, it was really the star of the region. So I think, that interest is still there. Of course, a lot of our clients and foreign investors are kind of on a wait and see mode, and a lot of companies are dealing with liquidity issues. And you know, as we progress on these, I think there will be a lot of investment opportunities. So you mentioned the OECD, and for me, that has been like one of the most important news that that we had during the pandemic. I'm a big fan. I'm Colombian, and I'm a big fan of investing and promoting my beautiful country. And it is a big change to be part of the OECD. So the accession process, you know, takes some time. There were a lot of changes before becoming a member, and now that that Colombia is a member, it has access to many discussions to be part of this very exclusive club, and really make changes that will promote the investment. Colombia has been considered for many years as one of the most favorable countries for foreign investment. And just to mention like few of the things where we see our clients really focusing and very interested in what the OECD means to Colombia in particular is the Anti-Bribery Convention, right? So, so that took some time to put together all the regulatory changes with respect to anti-bribery and to fight corruption. And that convention is very important. I mean, it's aimed at reducing political corruption and corporate crime, and really encouraging sanctions against bribery, right? So that that is an important factor when the clients are considering to invest in a country, to know that that there are controls, that that they know what they are getting into, right? And that you have a stable legal framework to deal with. Another thing that is becoming more and more important is responsible or sustainable investment. And the ESG factors, so the environment, social, and governance factors are really key for considering investments on portfolio companies. So on private equity, and you know, we Willkie, we are very active representing private equity funds. For the LPs, and on LPs, you have the majority of the limited partners that could be pension funds. For them, having a country again that is member of the OECD, that has that is investing a lot of time and energy on improving its governance, where companies, and you see a lot of multi-Latinas, Colombian multi-Latinas, that are very strong on ESG and have invested time and effort on improving that. That is key. Why? Because you know, that will be a way to attract more investment. And I think as far as we keep the economy a stable economy, and you know, we will go through and are going through a social crisis, but you know, I think the fundamentals are there. So so I would say you know, on the M&A perspective, as you mentioned, as the other panelists also mentioned, the crisis also create opportunities, and those opportunities, I will say, you know, I would put it kind of in three pockets for the M&A. So you have distress M&A, and you have some opportunities that will be presented there for the ones that have cash to really be deployed on those investments. Then you have some sectors that have been not that affected by the crisis, and on that you have logistics and technology and software. And then you have opportunities that will be you know, opportunistic deals that you will be able to get a good price on an asset. So so you know, I'm an optimistic.
Thank you. I'm an optimistic too. And also all about promoting Colombia. So Humberto, back to you. The World Bank, can you comment on specific programs or financing that have been done for Colombia or Latin America, and also your thoughts on what should be the countries should be doing today to get ahead on the recovery? You kind of alluded to education and some social programs, but maybe we can elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in the bank for this calendar year, we are expected to pour around $14 billion in Latin America. This is not a huge amount when you take into account the financing needs that we are expecting and the fiscal deficits that we are going to be observing. But together with what the IDB is doing, together with what the IMF is doing, CAF probably is going to be of some help. Because if you look at the spreads that many of the countries are facing, we are looking at an average for the whole Latin American region that is around 500, 600 basis points. So, I mean, the cost of financing has also increased in many of the countries. What we have done is we have divided our approach to the countries in 4 different phases. In the first phase, we started focusing mainly on what it was the health response, and we were looking at just health interventions, acquiring the inputs that you are going to need to deal with the medical emergency and so on and so forth. The second phase was basically focusing on basically supporting through existing, in many cases, safety nets, the population that has been hit badly. As I was mentioning before, it's difficult to expect that when you have high levels of informality, you ask people to stay at home and they are going to comply with the directive. No? And the third part, what we are looking is in helping the small firms. There is something that has happened in many countries is that the population has been granted the possibility of not having to pay their electricity, their water bills, and so on and so forth. Problem is that if you add this moratorium in payments with some of the delinquency rates that we are observing, many of these utilities are now under stress. So how we are going to be, I mean, you can support the population, but then you will have to look at what is the impact. No? So what are we going to be doing to support the small companies and SMEs, and so that what it should be a liquidity problem doesn't come a solvency problem. And finally, there is basically the reform, what I was referring before, how we are going to be rethinking about the region in the aftermath. So this is the way that we have structured our interventions, and we started with phase 1, the health, and we have been moving little by little towards the 3rd and the 4th. In the case of Colombia, we already approved $700 million in budget support, basically on the basis of reforms that have been implemented, covering mainly phase 1 and phase 2 of that strategy. And now what we are looking is a little bit more at phase 3 and phase 4. And indeed, in this moment, in these days, we are discussing with the government another loan and basically looking at what I was saying, utilities. So how we are going to be able to ensure that utilities that are suffering liquidity problems because of delays in payment by the population are going to be there. Public transportation. If you have a lockdown, people are not traveling, or at least they are not traveling as they were supposed to travel before. What are we going to be doing to help these companies? What are we going to be doing with the existing contracts for public-private partnerships? There were some assumptions, some expectations that they are not going to be met. How we are going to be adjusting these programs? Are we going to have to change some of the terms? Are we going to have to extend some of the terms of the contract, no? The duration of the contract? There is a second part which is related to what is more a transformation. I think that Colombia wants to take also this opportunity to basically rely more on clean energy and basically to start moving toward renewable energies. But clearly, to the extent that you are going to move in that direction, you will need power purchase agreements that basically are going to lead to allow you to have long-term contracts that perhaps now are not so familiar. There will be lots of investments that are going to be needed in order to have the ability to store energy. I mean, when you are thinking of renewables, you think of renewables on solar, you are thinking of wind, but clearly there is the problem, say, and when you produce and you don't have a peak of demand, what are you going to be doing with this kind of thing? No? So there are a bunch of things there that can be done, and that is not going to be just contributing to investment, to further investment, but it's going to contribute to changing the country, no? To move from a particular matrix of production to a new matrix. Finally, I think that Colombia is also moving into an additional area which is attracting long-term investment to finance infrastructure. I think that we all agree that infrastructure, I mean, the region has already a deficit in infrastructure. Public sector is not going to be able to be, as I was saying, being an engine in the investment, so we will need the private sector. But how are we going to be able to attract long-term financing for infrastructure? I think it's a big question. And once again, I think that what Colombia is doing is going to be extremely important. Back to you.
Wonderful, thank you. As a reminder to our audience, you can send your questions at any time through the chat, and we will read them at the end. So, Roberto, some years ago, you wrote a paper with Sebastian Edwards on the crisis hypothesis and on a reform economy. So this area of research basically states that in crisis is when you had the opportunity to do fundamental reforms, and there's a lot of cases on that. Could you please elaborate on the rationale of this hypothesis and if it's applicable to our countries today, as we have been hearing in the panel?
Thank you, Maria Paula. Sure, I hope it's applicable to our countries today. I mean, there is broad consensus, as Humberto was saying, that in Colombia and throughout the region, there is the need of undertaking reforms along several lines. Under one interpretation, which unfortunately might be prevalent as we speak, is that the government has limited political capital and should therefore prioritize its reform agenda. Well, under that interpretation, I think there is no doubt at all that fiscal consolidation is item number one in the agenda. The deterioration in all fiscal indicators following the pandemic are huge, and obviously, if you're going to rank needed reforms by priority, fiscal consolidation, which include hiking tax collections and probably privatizing several public firms, is item number one in the agenda. Unfortunately, that is the way forward, and we think that tax reform is imminent, and that's the only thing that we're going to be able to do. I would expect that that tax reform to be very similar to previous ones, in which we hike revenues, but we don't solve any of the well-identified problems with the tax code. It is regressive, inefficient, full of loopholes, and heavily tilted towards taxing firms rather than households. Under a different interpretation, and this goes to the point we studied with Sebastian Edwards out of UCLA many years ago, is that the government could entertain the notion that crises, such as the current one, are a very good opportunity to undertake more comprehensive reform efforts. And what we did with Edwards is that we studied in detail the reform agenda of the Gaviria administration in the early 1990s. There was a major structural reform. It was so comprehensive that it came to be known as the shake-up. And we studied the shake-up with Sebastian from a political economy dimension. And our main conclusion was that the shake-up conformed well to the notion that crises are a good environment to undertake an ambitious reform agenda. And bear in mind that in the early 1990s, Colombia was confronting our guerrilla warfare, attacks by drug cartels, and the effects of the Latin American debt crisis. Why do crises aid a comprehensive reform effort? Two issues are to be brought to the forefront. One is that when there is a crisis, there is broad consensus that things ought to change. Things cannot remain as they have been. So that might facilitate the formation of broader political coalitions. And furthermore, and this goes more into economics than into political science, if the reform effort is comprehensive, there is room for the use of so-called compensation mechanism. Just to, let me give you one example. In 1990, trade liberalization was supported by previously protected businesses. That came as a surprise. Why did they do that? Because trade liberalization came about with enhanced labor flexibility. So enhancing labor flexibility compensated previously protected businesses that were historically against liberalization. And how did it go about that? Labor unions supported labor flexibility. Well, because there was a comprehensive labor reform that, among other things, enhanced the rights of labor unions in all kinds of dimensions, the right to form unions, the right to go to strikes, and so on and so forth. In my view, the current crisis brings to the forefront the need to undertake several reforms, but including prominently two. One, certainly, item number one in the agenda, fiscal consolidation. But second, as Humberto was mentioning, I think the imperative need to formalize the economy in order to promote efficiency and, more importantly, to enhance inclusiveness. So on the second point, I'm not going to deal with the fiscal implications of the pandemic. They are quite clear. On the second point, the COVID crisis has revealed the huge costs that are incurred both by firms and workers that operate in the informal sector. And to be brief, a wide variety of generous government support programs have failed to benefit in a timely manner thousands of households and firms that are very difficult to identify and locate. They are so informal that nobody knows where they are, who they are. So reaching them in order to provide them the much needed assistance that is required at this stage of the pandemic is very difficult. Now, economists have long identified what are the main causes behind Colombia's informality, which include but are not limited to the very high non-wage labor costs. So a broad reform agenda that includes, for example, doing away with the loopholes in the corporate tax rate, while at the same time reducing non-wage labor costs, could certainly be palatable to businesses. On the other hand, becoming formal and therefore under the tax authorities' radar is more palatable for small firms if formality facilitates their access to government support programs under stressful situations. So I don't know if I'm naive or overly optimistic, but I am of the view that given that we are certainly under a crisis and that reforms are needed, I think we have to open our minds to the possibility that we should move away from this notion that political capital is limited, that we have to prioritize and only do the very important reforms, and maybe open our minds to this notion that crises are a good opportunity to have broader changes, more ambitious changes, and the crisis hypothesis is one that states that under this situation, it is probably easier to form broader political coalitions, and certainly the broader the reform agenda is, the easier it is to identify compensation mechanisms so that everybody can, in a certain manner, gain from the reform effort. Some people will lose in certain dimensions, some actors will lose in certain dimensions, but they can be compensated in certain others. Colombia already went through this kind of experience in the 1990s, and one would hope that that experience could be revisited this time around. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Very clear, and definitely a note of optimism and how to execute. Maria-Leticia, back to you. You started mentioning, and Humberto as well, key sectors where Colombia has huge investment opportunities. You're very close to this topic. You are day to day in the width of the conversations. What are the sectors that you are identifying for Colombia?
Sure, and Maria Paula, maybe just like briefly on what Roberto and Humberto said. I mean, just to really create these favorable environment for the investment, I think you know, I totally agree that this is a good opportunity for more comprehensive reforms. And you know, we touch on different things, right? On the public-private partnerships, the moving to clean energy. So you know, maybe to start, so currently there is an investment roadshow that is happening in the UK and the European Union, and many of the projects that are being presented by Colombia are with respect to infrastructure projects. So whether they are airports or roads, but it's very they're very active, and I think it started yesterday. We do see that interest and energy, so renewable energy, and the country has been spending a lot of time on working on that. The auctions that started last year had some very positive results. Some reforms have been happening, and Humberto also mentioned these. So one of the changes made to the auction guidelines was the extension of the power purchase agreement term, that it was initially 12 years. They moved it to 15 years, which is an important change for foreign investors. Another important point, and I think there is some changes to be made there, or discussions are still happening, is the denomination, right? So it's still on Colombian pesos, and then you have to handle the devaluation issues. So you know, maybe that's this is a good opportunity to attract more international players and make some changes into the guidelines there. We have been working on Puerto Antioquia, and that is one of the most important projects that the country is having now. So Puerto Antioquia is a greenfield multi-purpose port facility located in the Gulf of Urabá in Antioquia, and it's under a 30-year concession contract. And it will become the main outlet for Urabá's banana and fruit exports, which represent 75% of the Colombian exports. It was announced yesterday that the Global Infrastructure Partners, leading global independent infrastructure investor, closed a $110 million secure holding company term loan investment for that project. And on Puerto Antioquia, you know, it's important to mention, which goes also to the roadshow that is happening in the UK and the European Union, is that you have two sponsors that are French. So you have CMA CGM and FH, and those are big players. So that shows that that you have foreign investors really interested in that. Just to mention another example, so a few months ago, Macquarie Capital acquired a majority stake in the Briceño Tunja Sogamoso highway concession in Colombia. So things are happening, and we do believe that in energy and infra is where you will see the private sector really investing. And we talk a lot to our clients about that. And again, you know, to come back to the OECD, that is like a huge step that will be very favorable with the right conditions and right reforms to invest in Colombia. Technology. So Rappi last year was a huge and very great news that made us so proud to have, you know, a huge investment from SoftBank. And we do believe that that opened the door to have more investments on software and technology. And really, I mean, Colombia, I think, is the fourth country in Latin America that is really attracting and doing projects on that. To mention just another effort, Colombia Responde, the Bancoldex project, and Humberto mentioned these, is how important it is now during the crisis to really help the small and medium companies to come up and keep the entrepreneurs also engaged. So I think, you know, the role of the multilaterals and the role of Bancoldex is really important to keep the economy healthy and moving. So I will just mention, you know, those sectors.
Thank you. A lot of things going on that not everybody's aware, so thanks for the insight. We are almost over the time. We are going to go through the Q&A session. So as a reminder, please send the questions through the chat. We will start with one. The first one is, U.S. Ambassador Goldberg recently told the Colombian American Chamber of Commerce that Colombia should use the present crisis to improve rules, regulations, laws, which have limited its attractiveness to foreign investment. Does the panel agree? Perhaps, Maria-Leticia, we can start with you from the legal side and then let the other panelists comment on the structural.
I do agree with that. I mean, as I just mentioned, some of the things, but the terms of the public and private partnerships are really important. The discussion that regarding the auctions and the power purchase agreements are the term is important there. So yes, definitely there is room for reforms, and that would be very important. Look, I mean, I do believe also that this is creating a very good opportunity for Latin America, for Colombia and the rest of the region to really come up as to replace some of the investments that, let's say, the U.S. or Europe was having in China. So, here in the U.S. and in particular in New York, I was listening to Governor Cuomo every day, and one of the things that we were dealing with is how dependent we were on China. Well, Latin America is right here, so why don't we use this opportunity to become a new hub for some of those investments?
Perfect. There's another question on potential reforms on labor flexibility and an opportunity for internalization, some agreements for Colombia with Latin America in particularly more than with the US and China. So maybe Humberto or others can comment on maybe not only the formalization of the economy, but maybe an opportunity for increasing labor flexibility and internalization. Some thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Maria Paula. As I was saying before, we are well aware of the challenges of informality for many areas of the economy, tax collection, the ability to reach the informal population in need, etc., etc. What I was mentioning is that we were not expecting to see that informality was going to play the role that is playing in the current pandemic. This is, I think that if somebody had this into the radar screen, I would like to hear, because for us it was a total surprise. And what it happened is that when we started devising programs to mitigate the impact of the lockdowns on the population, it was extremely difficult because we didn't have many people under control. This is one part. And the second part, as I was mentioning, trying to ensure that small and micro enterprises could survive through the pandemic has another problem, is to the extent that you are formal, we can help you, but if you are informal, by definition, we don't have you in the radar screen. So that is an additional challenge that we are finding. I think that this is a good time to start thinking, okay, what we need to do. And I'm not going to pretend that the solution to informality in Latin America is an easy one. There are many issues. There is a lack of trust on governments by the population. And clearly, in many cases, they don't want to become formal. They don't want to start paying taxes or paying social security contribution because you don't trust the government. On the other side, in many cases, governments are not dealing with the regulatory frameworks that can be extremely complicated. I always like to repeat some statistics that comes from the World Bank doing business. If you want to open a new firm in Latin America, I'm taking the average for the whole region, it takes more time than opening it in sub-Saharan Africa. This is wrong. I mean, if we are talking about attracting investment, whether it is domestic or foreign, it cannot be that opening a new company is so cumbersome. I mean, we have to be flexible. What we need now is flexibility. What we need now is ingenuity to move forward. And what we need is public sectors that start having the flexibility the trust, that fight corruption, that are going to be dealing with challenges, but we know that they are there, and that will be important. And just in 10 seconds, on what Maria-Leticia was saying, foreign direct investment in Colombia is 2.5% of GDP for this year. Last year was 3.5, but it's not like other countries where you have 6-7% of GDP. I think that there is lots of space to attract FDI. I think it's going to be on the one side the regulatory framework. I think it's going to be on the other side sending a powerful message from the very top, from the leadership, that we want to do business with the world. Now that globalization has been put a bad label, I think it would be time to start saying, okay, we are open for business to everybody. Over.
Yeah, thank you. So unfortunately, we ran out of time, but thanks again for the amazing panelists. And this was a fascinating and very insightful information. I am more optimistic now on Colombia and the future and the unique opportunity that we have to take advantage today for the recovery tomorrow. Thanks again for the Colombian American Association and for all of you to participating in this panel. And we look forward to seeing Colombians' well-known resilience, innovation, and discipline playing a role in the recovery. So thanks again, and we'll meet you in the next event. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.